January 1943. Stalingrad. The rubble-strewn bank of the Volga River. Soviet Private Dmitri Volkov stood in a column of exhausted soldiers watching German prisoners march past toward collection points. The Germans shuffled in defeat, their faces hollow with hunger and cold, but Volkov's eyes fixed on their feet. The German boots, even after months of encirclement and starvation, remained intact. Leather uppers still held their shape. Soles are still attached to boots with recognizable stitching. Volkov looked down at his own feet. His kirza boots, the artificial leather standard issue of the Red Army, had separated at the seams 3 weeks earlier. He had bound them with wire scavenged from destroyed buildings. The soles were cardboard, a regulation issue, already worn through in 2 places. He had stuffed the interior with Pravda newspaper for insulation. His feet were numb. They had been numb since December. The Battle of Stalingrad had ended in Soviet victory, but victory revealed a crisis that would threaten every operation to follow. The Red Army had defeated the Wehrmacht through courage, tactical brilliance, and willingness to endure casualties that would have broken other armies. But courage could not march west on disintegrating boots. The Soviet soldiers' feet were failing faster than German resistance. The mathematics were stark and merciless. The Red Army fielded 6.5 million soldiers in January 1943. Each soldier required boots that could withstand winter conditions, summer heat, and the constant march of offensive operations. Soviet military doctrine calculated that each soldier wore through 2 pairs of boots annually under normal conditions. Combat conditions tripled that rate. The Red Army needed 40 million pairs of boots annually just to keep soldiers adequately shod. Soviet factories, those that survived German occupation, produced 12 million pairs per year for military and civilian needs combined. The deficit was 28 million pairs. This was not a gap that could be closed through exhortation or revolutionary spirit. The crisis had roots in Operation Barbarossa. When German forces invaded in June 1941, they captured or destroyed Soviet industrial capacity with systematic efficiency. The leather production facilities in Ukraine and Belarus, which had produced 70% of Soviet military leather goods, fell to the Wehrmacht in the first 6 months of the war. The factories that were evacuated east beyond the Urals required months to resume production, and even then operated at reduced capacity. By winter 1941, the Red Army was improvising. Soldiers wore valenki, traditional felt boots adequate for static defense, but useless for extended marching. They wore captured German boots when available. They wrapped their feet in rags and hoped. The winter of 1941 to 1942 produced 250,000 frostbite casualties in the Red Army. Medical reports filed with the Soviet High Command identified inadequate footwear as the primary cause in 60% of cases. Frostbite removed soldiers from combat as effectively as bullets. A division that lost 2,000 men to frozen feet lost its offensive capability regardless of ammunition or morale. The NKVD, the Soviet secret police, compiled detailed reports on equipment deficiencies. Documents declassified in the 1990s revealed that by January 1943, 40% of Red Army soldiers were classified as having unsatisfactory footwear. The reports were marked secret and forwarded to Stalin. The Soviet boot itself was inferior by design. The kirza boot used artificial leather, a cotton fabric impregnated with a mixture of rubber and synthetic materials. It was cheaper to produce than genuine leather and required less skilled labor to manufacture. Under ideal conditions, a kirza boot lasted 3 to 4 months. Combat conditions reduced that to 6 weeks. The sole was layered cardboard covered with a thin rubber coating. Water penetrated within days. The stitching was single thread, adequate for garrison duty, but prone to failure under stress. Soviet quality control, never rigorous in peacetime, collapsed under wartime production pressures. Boots arrived at the front with uneven stitching, improperly attached soles, and leather that cracked after minimal use. In March 1943, the first shipment of American boots arrived at the port of Murmansk. They came aboard Liberty ships that had survived the Arctic convoy route, the most dangerous supply line of the war. The boots were packed in wooden crates marked with English text and American military specifications. Soviet logistics officers opened the crates with skepticism born of ideology and experience. American equipment was capitalist luxury, theoretically inferior to Soviet functional design. The boots inside contradicted theory. They were the M1943 combat boot, standard issue for United States Army forces deploying to Europe. Full-grain leather uppers, double-stitched construction, direct-attach rubber soles, steel shank for arch support. Each boot weighed 2.1 pounds. Each pair came with detailed care instructions printed in Russian, translated by American military liaison officers. The boots were designed for European winter warfare, tested at temperatures ranging from -30 degrees Fahrenheit to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. They represented American industrial capacity applied to the problem of keeping soldiers mobile under the worst conditions imaginable. The Soviet Union had requested 15 million pairs of boots from the United States under the Lend-Lease program. The Americans had agreed to deliver them over a 30-month period beginning in March 1943. The first shipment was 100,000 pairs, a test to determine if American sizing and design would suit Soviet soldiers. The boots were distributed to units preparing for spring offensive operations. Political officers were instructed to document soldier reactions. The reports that came back would determine whether American boots would equip the Red Army's march to Berlin, or whether Soviet soldiers would advance in disintegrating kirza, their feet wrapped in yesterday's newspapers, their mobility constrained by industrial inadequacy that no amount of courage could overcome. The American M1943 combat boot arriving in Soviet hands represented engineering precision that Soviet factories could not replicate under wartime conditions. The boot's upper was constructed from full-grain leather, the highest quality leather available, taken from the outer layer of the hide where the grain was tightest and most durable. Soviet kirza boots used artificial leather that began deteriorating on contact with moisture. The American boot featured direct attach construction, where the rubber sole was vulcanized directly to the leather upper under heat and pressure, creating a waterproof bond that required specialized machinery. Soviet boots used stitched soles that separated under stress. The American boot incorporated a steel shank between the insole and outsole, providing arch support during extended marches. Soviet boots had no shank, leading to foot fatigue and stress injuries after 15 to 20 kilometers of marching. The American boot was double-stitched at every critical junction using waxed thread that resisted rot. Soviet boots used single stitching with untreated thread that failed when wet. The weight difference told the story of competing philosophies. The American M1943 weighed 4.2 pounds per pair. The Soviet kirza boot weighed 3.1 pounds per pair. Soviet logistics officers initially cited the American boot's extra weight as a disadvantage, additional burden for soldiers already carrying 40 pounds of equipment and ammunition. Field testing would prove that the extra 1.1 pounds purchased durability that multiplied combat effectiveness. The American boot's rubber sole was compounded with natural rubber and synthetic polymers, providing traction on ice, mud, and broken terrain. The Soviet boot's thin rubber coating over cardboard offered minimal traction and disintegrated within weeks. Temperature range testing demonstrated American design superiority. The M1943 remained flexible and functional at -30 degrees Fahrenheit, while Soviet boots became rigid and cracked at -15 degrees. At high temperatures, the American boot's leather breathed and allowed moisture to escape. The Soviet kirza boot trapped moisture, leading to fungal infections and trench foot. In April 1943, the Red Army Quartermaster Corps initiated comparative testing at multiple fronts. Units received American boots alongside Soviet standard issue and captured German boots for direct comparison under identical combat conditions. The testing protocols were rigorous. Soldiers marched 25 kilometers daily over varied terrain, typical of offensive operations. They forded streams, climbed hills, traversed muddy roads, and operated in temperatures ranging from freezing nights to warm afternoons. Inspectors examined boots every 5 days, documenting wear patterns, structural failures, and soldier reports of comfort and functionality. The results were documented in reports filed with the Soviet Ministry of Defense, declassified only after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. American boots averaged 480 kilometers before sole separation, the most common failure mode. Soviet kirza boots failed at an average of 180 kilometers, less than 40% of American boot longevity. Captured German boots, which Soviet soldiers had previously considered superior to domestic production, averaged 320 kilometers before failure. The American boot outlasted German boots by 50% and Soviet boots by 266%. These numbers translated directly into combat effectiveness. A Soviet offensive covering 400 kilometers required one resupply of American boots per soldier. The same offensive required 3 resupplies of Soviet boots, tripling the logistics burden and reducing the speed of advance. Medical data reinforced the superiority. Units equipped with American boots reported 60% fewer cold weather foot injuries compared to units wearing Soviet boots. Frostbite cases dropped from 12 per thousand soldiers to 5 per thousand. Trench foot infections caused by prolonged moisture exposure decreased by 70%. These reductions meant more soldiers remained combat effective, more units maintained offensive capability, and more ground could be taken with fewer delays for medical evacuation and replacement. Soviet soldiers recognized quality immediately. Political officers filed reports expressing concern about the ideological implications. Soldiers were praising American manufacturing, comparing Soviet boots unfavorably to capitalist production. One report from the 62nd Army, which had fought at Stalingrad, noted that soldiers called American boots felt slippers, the highest compliment possible in Russian military culture. Valenki, traditional felt boots, were prized possessions. To compare American leather boots to Valenki indicated that soldiers considered them equally valuable. Another report documented soldiers refusing to turn in American boots even when offered replacements. The boots were too valuable. They represented mobility, comfort, and survival. Black market value reflected this. By summer 1943, a pair of American boots could be traded for 2 to 3 months of a soldier's salary. One documented case involved a soldier court-martialed for trading newly issued Soviet boots for used American boots acquired from a wounded comrade. The offense was considered serious enough to warrant a military tribunal. American production capacity made Soviet supply possible. The United States contracted with 67 manufacturers to produce boots for Lend-Lease delivery to the Soviet Union. These manufacturers ranged from major shoe companies to smaller regional factories retooled for military production. At peak production in 1944, American factories produced 500,000 pairs monthly designated for Soviet delivery. This production was separate from boots produced for American forces, British forces, and other allied nations. The logistics of delivery required coordination across 3 major routes. The Arctic convoys to Murmansk braved German submarine attacks and winter storms to deliver boots to northern Soviet ports. The Pacific route through Vladivostok brought boots across Siberia on the Trans-Siberian Railway. The Persian corridor, running through Iran, delivered 1.8 million pairs through the southern supply route. Each boot bore stamps indicating production date, manufacturer, and quality control inspection approval. American military standards rejected boots for defects that Soviet factories would have considered acceptable. A misaligned stitch, a slight color variation in leather, a sole attachment that met specifications but not optimal standards, all resulted in rejection. The rejected boots were sold as surplus or used for training. Only boots meeting full military specifications were shipped to the Soviet Union. June 1944. The forests of Belarus stretched before the Red Army like an ocean of green concealing German fortifications that had held for 3 years. Operation Bagration, named for a Russian general who had fought Napoleon, would be the largest Soviet offensive of the war. The objective was straightforward and brutal: destroy German Army Group Center, advance 560 kilometers in 60 days, and open the road to Poland. Success required 2.3 million Soviet soldiers to maintain mobility across terrain that varied from dense forest to open steppe, from river crossings to urban fighting. The average soldier would march 20 to 25 kilometers daily for 2 months. Over 60 days, each man would cover at least 1,500 kilometers on foot. Boots would determine whether the offensive succeeded or stalled in the forests of Belarus. Soviet logistics officers had calculated requirements with precision, born of 3 years of hard lessons. Operation Bagration forces received 1.6 million pairs of American boots in the weeks before the offensive launched. This represented 70% of the attacking force. The remaining 30% wore Soviet boots, newly manufactured and shipped directly from factories in the Urals. The contrast would be measured in mobility, casualties, and the speed of advance. Soviet military doctrine emphasized rapid offensive action, maintaining pressure on retreating enemies and exploiting breakthroughs before defenders could establish new lines. Soldiers who could not march could not maintain the offensive tempo. Units forced to halt for boot resupply created gaps in the advance that German forces could exploit. The offensive began on June 23 with artillery barrages that announced Soviet intentions. Within 48 hours, Soviet forces had penetrated German defensive lines and were advancing west at speeds that surprised even Soviet commanders. German Army Group Center, 400,000 men strong, began to collapse under coordinated attacks from multiple directions. The march west had begun, and American boots carried most of the soldiers making it. Soviet after-action reports, compiled at division and army level, documented the correlation between equipment and performance. Units equipped primarily with American boots maintained 90% march capability after 30 days of continuous operations. March capability measured the percentage of soldiers able to continue offensive operations without medical intervention for foot injuries, equipment failure, or exhaustion related to inadequate footwear. Units equipped primarily with Soviet boots showed 60% march capability after the same period. The 30% difference translated into divisions that could continue attacking versus divisions that required rest and resupply. Medical statistics reinforce the equipment advantage. Foot-related casualties, including frostbite, trench foot, blisters severe enough to require medical treatment, and stress fractures caused by inadequate arch support, ran 40% lower in units wearing American boots. A rifle division of 10,000 men typically suffered 800-foot casualties over 30 days of operations when equipped with Soviet boots. The same division equipped with American boots suffered 480-foot casualties. The difference of 320 men represented an entire rifle company, a unit capable of holding a defensive position or exploiting a breakthrough. Multiply that difference across 2.3 million soldiers, and the impact became strategically significant. Operation Bagration achieved its objective of 560 kilometers in 60 days, making it the fastest Soviet offensive operation to that point in the war. The speed of advance prevented German forces from establishing coherent defensive lines and resulted in the destruction of 28 German divisions. German intelligence officers, interrogating captured Soviet soldiers, noted in reports filed with Wehrmacht headquarters that Soviet forces appeared better equipped than in previous years. Specific mention was made of footwear quality. German soldiers in 1944 were experiencing their own equipment crisis. Leather shortages in Germany meant that German boots were declining in quality even as Soviet boots improved through American supply. The reversal was complete. In 1941, Soviet soldiers had envied German boots. By 1944, German soldiers noticed that their enemies marched in boots superior to their own. Soviet soldiers who survived the war wrote memoirs decades later, after the collapse of the Soviet Union made honest discussion of Lend-Lease contributions possible. These memoirs, published in the 1990s and 2000s, consistently identified American boots as essential equipment. Veterans who had fought in both the desperate retreats of 1941 to 1942 and the victorious advances of 1943 to 1945 emphasized the equipment difference. One veteran, writing in 1998, stated that in 1941 he had wrapped his feet in rags torn from German uniforms. In 1944, he wore American boots that carried him from Belarus to Berlin without failure. Another veteran, interviewed in 2002, calculated that he had marched approximately 3,000 kilometers in American boots during the final 2 years of the war. The boots had been resoled once by a Soviet field cobbler, but otherwise remained intact. He kept those boots for 40 years after the war ended, refusing to discard them despite his wife's complaints about storing old military equipment. The crossing of the Berezina River in early July demonstrated boot performance under extreme conditions. Soviet engineers constructed pontoon bridges under German artillery fire. Infantry crossed in single file, boots submerged in river water, then immediately marched another 15 kilometers to maintain offensive pressure. American boots, designed with waterproof construction, dried quickly and maintained structural integrity. Soviet boots, with their cardboard soles and poor stitching, often disintegrated during river crossings. Units wearing Soviet boots suffered equipment failures that forced soldiers to march barefoot or bind their feet with cloth until resupply arrived. The Belarusian swamps presented similar challenges. Summer rains turned unpaved roads into mud traps. Soldiers marched through standing water for hours. American boots resisted water penetration. Soviet boots absorbed water, became heavy, and fell apart. January 1945. The Vistula River marked the boundary between liberated Poland and the German Reich. On the eastern bank, 2.2 million Soviet soldiers prepared for the final assault that would carry them to Berlin. The Vistula-Oder offensive would cover 480 kilometers in 23 days, the fastest sustained advance of the entire war. Winter conditions made the operation particularly demanding. Temperatures ranged from -15 degrees Celsius to -25 degrees Celsius. Snow covered the ground in layers that alternated with freezing rain, creating conditions that turned roads into ice fields and unpaved areas into frozen mud. Soldiers would march through these conditions for 3 weeks without pause. The offensive's success depended entirely on mobility, and mobility depended on boots that could withstand cold that had stopped armies before. Soviet medical officers filed reports throughout the offensive documenting equipment performance under extreme conditions. Units equipped with American boots maintained 85% serviceability after the 23-day operation. Serviceability meant boots remained structurally intact with soles attached, uppers uncracked, and sufficient waterproofing to prevent frostbite. Units equipped with Soviet boots showed 45% serviceability after the same period. The difference was not marginal. It was the difference between a division that could continue attacking and a division that required emergency resupply before resuming operations. Replacement demand illustrated the gap. Units wearing Soviet boots required 3 times more emergency boot deliveries during the offensive compared to units wearing American boots. Each emergency resupply required trucks, drivers, fuel, and logistics coordination that diverted resources from ammunition and food delivery. The Soviet supply system in January 1945 operated at maximum extension. Supply lines stretched 1,800 kilometers from rear area depots in Russia through Poland to the front lines in Germany. Every kilogram of material required transport across this distance. American boots continued arriving throughout the offensive. Ships docked at Murmansk and Vladivostok, carrying crates marked for immediate forward delivery. Trucks transported the boots west along roads that barely existed. The United States shipped 800,000 pairs of boots to the Soviet Union between January and March 1945, specifically to sustain the final offensives. These boots arrived in time to equip reserve units being committed to maintain momentum as the advance reached German soil. German forces defending their homeland faced an equipment crisis that mirrored Soviet problems of 1941. German leather production had collapsed under Allied bombing and loss of occupied territories. German soldiers in 1945 often wore boots with wooden soles or boots constructed from ersatz materials that failed under stress. German prisoners captured during the Vistula-Oder offensive frequently wore boots inferior to those worn by their Soviet captors. The reversal was complete and symbolic. In 1941, German soldiers had marched east in boots that Soviet soldiers envied. In 1945, Soviet soldiers marched west in American boots, superior to anything the Wehrmacht possessed. One Soviet report noted the irony with clinical precision. German prisoners were issued temporary footwear from captured German stocks because their own boots were inadequate for the march to prison camps. Meanwhile, Soviet guards wore American boots that had carried them hundreds of kilometers without failure. The advance reached German cities in February. Urban warfare presented different challenges than open terrain. Soldiers climbed through rubble from collapsed buildings. They moved through streets covered with broken glass from shattered windows. They fought in flooded basements where water stood ankle-deep for hours. American boot design proved advantageous in every condition. The rubber sole provided traction on debris that would have been treacherous in leather-soled boots. The double-stitched construction prevented separation when soldiers climbed over sharp edges. The waterproofing kept feet dry during extended periods in flooded buildings. Soviet after-action reports from urban combat operations noted minimal boot-related casualties. Soldiers continued fighting without equipment failures that would have degraded combat effectiveness. Berlin represented the final test. The assault on the German capital began on April 16th and continued until May 2nd, when the city surrendered. Street-to-street fighting required soldiers to move constantly through the most difficult terrain imaginable. Buildings reduced to rubble created obstacle courses that had to be navigated under fire. Sewers and underground passages provided routes of advance, but meant hours in cold water. The Spree River ran through the city, requiring multiple crossings. Soviet soldiers advanced through all of it, and American boots maintained integrity throughout. German defenders, many of them young conscripts and old men from the Volkssturm, wore whatever footwear could be found. Some wore civilian shoes. Others wore boots taken from dead soldiers. The contrast between attacker and defender equipment was visible in every engagement. Captured German documents provided an enemy perspective on Soviet capabilities. Wehrmacht intelligence reports from early 1945 described Soviet forces as well-equipped across all categories. Specific mention was made of footwear. German officers noted that Soviet soldiers appeared to be wearing standardized high-quality boots, a significant change from earlier years when Soviet footwear had been noticeably inferior. The German analysis was correct in observation, but incomplete in understanding. The boots were standardized and high quality because they were American, produced in factories that were never bombed, shipped across oceans that Germany could no longer contest, and distributed through supply lines that German forces could no longer disrupt. May 1945. Soviet soldiers stood in the ruins of Berlin wearing American boots. The Reich had surrendered. The war in Europe had ended. Photographs taken during the victory celebrations show Soviet flags raised over the Reichstag, soldiers embracing in the streets, and crowds celebrating in Moscow. The photographs do not show the boots. That omission was not accidental. It was policy that would define Soviet historical narrative for the next 50 years. Stalin addressed the Soviet people on May 9, 1945, declaring victory achieved through the heroism and sacrifice of the Red Army and the Soviet people. The speech made no mention of Allied material assistance. This omission established the official position that would be maintained throughout the Cold War. Soviet victory was Soviet achievement, won by Soviet soldiers using Soviet equipment and Soviet tactics. The contribution of American trucks, aircraft, food, and boots was minimized in public statements and eventually erased from official histories. The physical evidence was more difficult to erase. Millions of Soviet soldiers had worn American boots during the final 2 years of the war. Those soldiers returned home with the boots on their feet. Veterans knew what they had worn. Their families saw the American markings on the leather. The boots were tangible proof of Allied cooperation that contradicted the emerging Cold War narrative. The Soviet solution was systematic suppression. Military museums that opened after the war displayed Soviet equipment exclusively. Captured German equipment was shown as evidence of Soviet superiority. American Lend-Lease equipment was stored in back rooms or destroyed. Photographs from the war years were reviewed and edited. Images showing soldiers in American boots were cropped to remove feet or captioned to identify boots as Soviet-made. Official histories published in the 1950s and 1960s acknowledged Lend-Lease in footnotes, but emphasized that Soviet production was primary and Allied assistance was secondary. The implication was that the Soviet Union could have won without American help, though it might have taken longer. This narrative was taught in schools, repeated in official publications, and enforced through state control of historical research. The numbers that contradicted this narrative were classified. Soviet archives contained detailed documentation of Lend-Lease deliveries, performance assessments, and strategic impact. These documents were marked secret and stored in Ministry of Defense archives inaccessible to historians. Declassification began only in the 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapsed and Russian historians gained access to previously restricted materials. The documents revealed systematic dependency. The Soviet Union had received 15.4 million pairs of boots from the United States between 1943 and 1945. Soviet domestic production during the same period totaled 10.2 million pairs of military boots, and many of those were inferior quality. The mathematics were straightforward. Without American boots, 40% of Red Army soldiers would have worn inadequate footwear during the offensives that won the war. Soviet internal assessments, written for high-level officials and never intended for public release, stated explicitly that American footwear was essential to maintaining offensive tempo from 1943 to 1945. Nikita Khrushchev, who succeeded Stalin and had served as a political commissar during the war, acknowledged reality in his memoirs published after his removal from power. Writing in the 1970s, Khrushchev stated that without Lend-Lease, the Soviet Union would have been in a very difficult situation. He did not specify boots, but the admission contradicted official Soviet history. Other Soviet officials who wrote memoirs after retirement made similar admissions. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the most decorated Soviet commander of the war, stated in private conversations recorded by aides that Lend-Lease was crucial to Soviet victory. These admissions remained private or were published outside the Soviet Union, where they could not challenge official narratives. Soviet veterans understood the truth because they had lived it. After the Cold War ended and veterans could speak freely without fear of official consequences, their testimonies filled gaps in historical record. Memoirs published in the 1990s and 2000s openly discussed American equipment. Veterans described receiving American boots, comparing them favorably to Soviet equipment, and acknowledging that American supplies made victory possible. One veteran, interviewed in 1997, stated that Soviet soldiers won because of their courage and American equipment, and both were necessary. Another veteran, writing in 2003, calculated that he had marched 3,000 kilometers in American boots that never failed, while Soviet boots had failed after 300 kilometers during earlier campaigns. A third veteran, speaking at a memorial ceremony in 2005, told students that his generation owed its victory to Soviet bravery and American factories, and anyone who denied either contribution was lying. Generational memory preserved what official history suppressed. Soviet veterans kept their American boots for decades after the war. Families stored the boots as heirlooms, physical evidence of their fathers' and grandfathers' service. Some boots were eventually donated to local museums after veterans died. Others remained in private collections. The boots became symbols of a cooperation that had been officially forgotten but privately remembered. Veterans' organizations, formed in the 1960s and 1970s, became informal repositories of accurate history. Veterans shared stories at meetings and reunions that contradicted what their children learned in schools. This parallel history, transmitted through personal testimony rather than official channels, preserved knowledge that would eventually correct the historical record. American perspective on the boot program was documented but not widely publicized. United States military records showed that 15.4 million pairs of boots delivered to the Soviet Union represented 8% of total American military boot production from 1943 to 1945. The cost was approximately $154 million in 1940s currency. American military analysts assessed the boot program as among the most cost-effective Lend-Lease contributions. Every dollar spent on boots kept Soviet soldiers mobile and maintained offensive pressure that tied down German forces. Those German forces, fixed on the Eastern Front, could not reinforce defenses in France or Italy. The Second World War was decided by industrial capacity as much as battlefield courage. Victory required tanks, aircraft, ammunition, fuel, and the mundane items that armies overlook until their absence cripples operations. Boots belong to this second category. They received no glory in victory parades. They appeared in no propaganda posters. Yet their absence could stop an army as effectively as destroyed bridges or empty fuel tanks. The Soviet Union possessed strengths that made victory possible: vast manpower reserves, tactical adaptation learned through brutal experience, strategic depth that absorbed initial defeats, and ideological motivation that sustained soldiers through conditions that would have broken other armies. The Soviet Union also possessed a critical weakness. German invasion had destroyed 70% of industrial capacity in the first 6 months of the war. Factories that survived were evacuated east and required months to resume production at reduced output. The gap between what Soviet industry could produce and what the Red Army required created vulnerability that threatened to undermine military excellence. American industrial capacity filled that gap with precision. The United States, protected by oceans from direct attack, operated factories at full capacity throughout the war. American production focused on items that leveraged manufacturing advantages: trucks, aircraft, communications equipment, processed food, and boots. The Soviet Union focused on items that required less complex industrial processes: tanks, artillery, small arms, and ammunition. This division of labor was never formally negotiated. It emerged from practical assessment of what each nation could produce most efficiently. The result was strategic complementarity. Soviet soldiers drove American trucks, ate American canned food, communicated on American radios, and marched in American boots while fighting with Soviet rifles, supported by Soviet tanks and Soviet artillery. Neither nation could have achieved victory alone. Together, they possessed capabilities that exceeded the sum of individual contributions. Soviet boot production illustrated the pattern. The Soviet Union could produce adequate boots during peacetime when demand was predictable and industrial capacity was intact. War destroyed both conditions. Demand increased sixfold while production capacity decreased by 2/3. The gap could not be closed through exhortation or ideological commitment. American boots arrived precisely when Soviet need was greatest, 1943 to 1945, the period of continuous offensive operations that drove German forces from Soviet territory through Eastern Europe and into Germany itself. Without those boots, Soviet offensives would have been slower, required more frequent pauses for resupply, and produced higher casualty rates from preventable foot injuries. The delay might have extended the war by 6 to 12 months, resulting in hundreds of thousands of additional casualties on all sides. The historical record was obscured for political reasons that had nothing to do with military reality. Cold War rivalry required both sides to construct narratives that emphasized independence and minimized cooperation. Soviet historians, working under state censorship, produced accounts that acknowledged Lend-Lease in footnotes while insisting Soviet production was sufficient for victory. American historians, writing for audiences that demanded recognition of American contributions, sometimes overclaimed the significance of Lend-Lease and understated Soviet military achievement. The truth existed between these narratives. Soviet soldiers won the war through courage, skill, and willingness to accept casualties that would have been politically impossible in Western democracies. American factories made that victory faster, less costly, and more certain by providing equipment that Soviet industry could not produce in adequate quantities. Post-Soviet historical scholarship corrected the record. After 1991, Russian historians gained access to previously classified documents that quantified Lend-Lease contributions. The numbers supported what veterans had always known. American assistance was not decisive in the sense that the Soviet Union would have lost without it, but it was crucial in determining when victory would be achieved and at what cost. Contemporary Russian military museums now include Lend-Lease exhibitions displaying American trucks, aircraft, canned food, and boots. The exhibits acknowledge cooperation that official Soviet history had suppressed for 5 decades. Veterans who survived long enough to see these exhibits expressed satisfaction that accurate history was finally being presented to younger generations. Military logistics professionals study the boot program as a case study in alliance effectiveness. Modern military doctrine emphasizes that armies require support in multiple categories, and neglecting any category can produce strategic failure. Boots, socks, and underwear seem trivial compared to tanks and aircraft, but soldiers cannot fight without them. Frostbite casualties from inadequate boots remove soldiers from combat as effectively as enemy fire. Armies that neglect basic equipment create vulnerabilities that enemies can exploit. The American boot program demonstrated that effective alliances identify gaps in partner capabilities and fill them efficiently. The United States did not try to tell the Soviet Union how to design tanks or train infantry. American assistance focused on areas where Soviet weakness was clear and American strength was substantial. The M1943 combat boot that carried Soviet soldiers to Berlin is preserved in military museums in Moscow and other Russian cities. The museum placard, updated after Soviet archives opened, now reads, "American manufactured boot, Lend-Lease program, worn by Soviet soldiers during advance to Berlin, 1944 to 1945. The boot is leather, weathered from use, with clear manufacturer markings stamped into the upper. It represents cooperation between nations that became enemies within months of achieving shared victory. The boot is evidence that ideological opponents can work together when confronted with existential threats. It demonstrates that victory in modern war requires industrial capacity, logistical coordination, and willingness to acknowledge that no nation possesses all necessary strengths. Most of the soldiers who wore American boots are gone. They marched from Stalingrad to Berlin, survived the war, returned home, and lived lives shaped by experiences most people cannot imagine. They knew what they had worn. They knew where it came from. They knew that courage alone does not win wars when boots disintegrate after 180 kilometers and the road to Berlin is 2,800 kilometers long. 2 million Soviet soldiers marched to Berlin in the final years of the war. American boots carried them there. Victory required both nations' contributions. The boots are proof, preserved in museums and memories, that the Second World War was won through cooperation that official histories tried to erase but could never entirely destroy.